Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast. This week, I'm talking about a film from 1999 that I'm sure you'll agree everyone really cares about.
Who cares about this stupid election?
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew, as always. That's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, it's given away in the title. I'm here to talk of the stories of film. And I tend to talk about production stories, development stories, marketing stories, release stories, all those ingredients, really, that go towards making the films that we know and sometimes love. Just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to cover on this podcast, they tend to lean more towards the mainstream than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try not to do snark. I try not to punch down. This podcast is a celebration of cinema, a real appreciation of just how hard it is to get a movie made. Without further ado, it's enough preamble, isn't it? I'm going to move on straight away to the first of the two films I'm talking about in this episode of Film Stories, and we're going back to 1999 for it. Let me play you a clip from the not very good trailer, and I'll come to the story, the other side of this.
In the nation's capital, a new leader has found a place in the halls of power. But her story began in the halls of high school.
We'll move on now to the presidential race with three candidates running. The first is Tracy Flick.
One thing that's important to know about me is that I'm an only child. My mom is really devoted to me. She likes to write letters to successful women like Elizabeth Dole and Connie Chung and ask them what advice do they have for me, Tracy, her daughter.
The next candidate for student body president is Paul Metzler.
I just don't think somebody would do something like that on purpose.
I think you did it.
And if you want to keep questioning me like this, I won't continue without my attorney present. I do not often speak with you and ask for things. But now I really must insist that you help me win the election tomorrow, because I deserve it and Paul Metzler doesn't, as you well know.
The final candidate, sophomore Tammy Metzler.
I'm attracted to the person. It's just that all the people I've ever been attracted to happen to be girls.
You should stop her. She's not qualified.
We can't both run, can we? I mean, we're brother and sister. Can we? Tracy and I are totally in love. In love? Yeah.
So is this a moral situation or an ethical situation?
When I win the presidency, that means you and I are going to be spending a lot of time together.
Cast your vote for Tracy Flick next week. You won't just be voting for me. You'll be voting for yourself.
Who knew how high she would climb in life? I had to stop her.
Excuse me!
And that is a clip from the wonderful Election, dating back to 1999, directed by Alexander Payne. Payne also co-wrote the screenplay with Jim Taylor, based on the book Election by Tom Perrotta, and starring Matthew Broderick and Reese Witherspoon in the two lead roles for the film. Now, writer-director Alexander Payne, who, just as I'm recording, is about to release his latest movie, The Holdovers, who never really thought he'd make a high school film, as much as he was a fan of films such as Fast Times at Ridgemont High, as many people were and are. He wasn't really into the high school movies that followed in its wake, and he really had no interest in adding to the list of unsuccessful, uninteresting high school films. And so instead, he made his feature directorial debut with a comedy by the name of Citizen Ruth, starring Laura Dern, and that very much got him attention and got him on the map, and people started sending him possible material. Now, while Payne was building up his film career, a writer by the name of Tom Perrotta had got the inspiration for what would become Election. And there were two threads that were noodling in his head. The first was the 1992 American presidential election. This was the one that saw a three-way fight between George Bush I, Bill Clinton, and an independent Ross Perot. And they went head to head. And in Clinton's case, it was against a backdrop of questions as to, how do I delicately put this, how good he was at keeping his trousers on. And as Perrotta explained to the excellent book by Brian Raftery, I've talked about it a few times in this podcast, Best Movie Year Ever, he said the Republican Party talking point was if he's cheated on his wife, he's going to cheat on the country. And Perrotta reasoned it seemed like they were advancing this simplistic, moralistic philosophy about character. And he just felt felt something wasn't right about it. So that was the large-scale inspiration for the story he wanted to tell. On a smaller scale, Perrotta had read about an incident in Wisconsin in the US over the election of a high school homecoming queen, and when it was discovered she was pregnant, well, things didn't quite, let's just say the election got a little bit muddied, and the result was called into question, and the results were ultimately burned once questions started being asked. And so there it was on a smaller scale as well. And so he took this pair of threads and fashioned them into a short novel by the name of Election that he then tried to get published. It's quite a slim text. It runs to about 200 pages, but initially he couldn't really get a lot of interest in it. And yet in 1997 he enjoyed success with a novel by the name of The Wishbones, and that gave him a little bit more currency and got him a bit of attention as well, and also got him away to movie producers too. That he tried shopping Election around, wasn't getting an awful lot of joy, but this time he'd attracted the interest of a pair of producers, Albert Berger and Ron Yerkser, and they were sent the unpublished manuscript to Election that was still looking for a publisher, and the pair of them were interested. They took out an option on it, started shopping the story around, and they found a home at MTV Films, part of the Paramount empire. And what MTV was looking for was just edgy material. It was looking for live action stuff. It had broken through with the first Beavis and Butthead movie, but it was trying to just be a little bit out there in live action features as well. And to give an example, the films that it was chasing around this point were Being John Malkovich and the film Go from Doug Liman, both of which went elsewhere. Now, this in the end was the story that MTV landed, and MTV was also passionate about, thanks in no small part to an executive at the company called Van Toffler, great name. Alexander Payne had, if I've got my timelines correct meanwhile, already been sent a copy of the unpublished novel at this point back in 1996, but he hadn't read it, and he hadn't instantly read it for the reason I gave at the start. The idea of a high school movie, well, no thanks. And so this, on the surface, wasn't the kind of project he was looking to make. Now, the problem within MTV was Van Toffler knew that he was going to have an uphill struggle to get the film made, to get it noticed, to get it out there, because reading the text, there was no way this was not going to carry an R rating in the US. Now, Paramount Pictures in particular, MTV's parent, remember, was really concerned about the idea of an R-rated high school movie. Now, American Pie hadn't spiked at this point, which was R-rated in a very different way. And it was very clear that what Election wasn't was your standard high school text, that it was different from what else was out there. This was really edgy, dark black comedy at its source, and so it was, without question, a risk and a half. Still, by the start of 1997, Alexander Payne had got round to reading the novel and was very, very in. That once he got past his initial misgivings, he saw what was in this story, and the rights were secured, and he was on board to make it his second feature as director, with Jim Taylor coming on to co-write the script. Taylor had co-written Citizen Ruth with Alexander Payne, and he reflected in a piece with the Huffington Post published many years after the film's release, "As soon as I read the novel, I knew it was perfect material for us." And he said, "I wished I could say that's happened a lot over the years, but it hasn't. It's sort of a unique experience." But that didn't mean it was going to be a very easy novel to adapt, because it might only be 200 pages, but also it comes from the viewpoint of 16 main characters centred around a high school election, and chapters are broken down into individual characters having their individual narration. And they knew straight away for a start, well, you can't have 16 voices, you can't have 16 main characters in a film. This has to be slimmed down. And so they slimmed it down to 4. They went with a lead character by the name of Tracy Flick, a teacher by the name of Jim McAllister, and then a brother and sister also involved in the election, Tammy Metzler and Paul Metzler. They also reset the film from New Jersey to somewhere a little bit quieter. They decided to site it in Omaha, a little more remote, a little bit close to home for Alexander Payne as well. And they could start developing their story and putting their script together. But also this was for Alexander Payne a little bit of a culture shock, because now he was in a studio environment for the first time, and as the script was coming together, and even appreciating this wasn't going to cost MTV an awful lot of money, well, there was pressure to put certain names in there, because as much as independent film was bubbling in the 1990s, a lot of the independent films that had broken through relied on a star name in there. You think to 1994's Pulp Fiction, you think to Copland, which I've covered just a week or two ago on this podcast. And so Paramount figured that the supporting role of Jim McAllister, really, they could get a big name. Well, certainly they wanted a big name. They were suggesting Tom Hanks. They were suggesting Tom Cruise. And it wasn't that Alexander Payne wasn't a fan of either. He didn't really see Tom Cruise in the role, but you could see Tom Hanks. But there's no way Tom Hanks was going to say yes to it. But also they weren't quite who Payne was looking for. That he was looking for an actor in the role of Mr. McAllister who would bring some instant gravitas to it. The kind of actor whose recognisable face means you know that as soon as they appear on the screen that they've brought something extra from the off. They weren't an unknown. And so Payne and Paramount had individual lists of who that person would be. There was one obvious overlap, someone who'd made a very famous movie with Paramount Pictures, Matthew Broderick, the star, of course, of Ferris Bueller's Day Off and, of course, 2 of War Games. And at this point, he was on the verge of a lot of success with the stage musical of The Producers as well. So the script got sent his way, and as Broderick reflected to the Huffington Post, he said, I remember reading that and thinking it was an interesting story, the dialogue and all of it. And he said, I didn't have a job at the time. I read it and I thought, hit, it says. I think there might be a letter missing there. I wish I could get jobs like that. And it was his manager at the time who'd sent it to him, but it wasn't sent to him with an offer for the role. It was just like, this is good, you should read it. There were other actors in for the role as well, but Alexander Payne hadn't quite decided who his Mr. McAllister was going to be. So Broderick said, I loved it, and the next step was to meet with Alexander. Well, Broderick had picked up a role. By the point that happened, he was shooting Godzilla for Roland Emmerich, imagine. And he wasn't a shoo-in. In fact, there was a rumour at one point that Tim Robbins had already had an offer that for whatever reason that didn't work out. And also Tom Perrotta, go back to the original writer of the novel, he just wasn't convinced either. He thought there's something a little bit too sweet and innocent about Broderick's persona. How could that really work with that character? But he opted to trust the director and would reflect in hindsight, this was a very, very good decision. Payne was very clear that this was their man, and they had a meeting on the set of Godzilla. And also it was producer David Gale who saw the through line from Ferris Bueller to this, that in Ferris Bueller's Day Off, Broderick is the student. Now he's the teacher. There's a hook in that. And even though Alexander Payne apparently hadn't watched Ferris Bueller, David Gale, the producer, certainly had, and it all seemed to knit together. The offer went to Broderick and he landed the role. But what are the other roles? Well, Thora Birch was said to have been cast at one point in the role of Tammy Metzler, but that was also the part that Reese Witherspoon, then in her early career, decided to audition for, at least in the first instance. Now, Thora Birch would drop out, whatever happened there, I couldn't quite get to the bottom of, but Witherspoon turned up for a meeting with Payne and decided, really, in the end, she should go for this role of Tracy Flick, and she got totally into character for the meeting. She said to Alexander Payne, I guess you could hire someone else for this job, but I'm the best person for it. And this clicked enormously with Payne. He saw straight away that she could completely nail this character. As the Los Angeles Times reported around the point, Payne had apparently first seen her in a small-scale production called Man in the Moon, not that one. And he'd also seen a small part of Witherspoon's breakthrough movie, Freeway. Really interesting film, that. Really edgy one again. And as he was giving interviews for the film, he talked about how pleased he was with the choice, and he just said of Witherspoon, she approached her role without vanity, unlike many young American actors who get so concerned with how they look. And he said it's not about being pretty. He wanted this character. He wanted the character on screen. He felt Witherspoon delivered that. Now, Chris Klein, meanwhile, was a complete unknown, and he came to the attention of Payne while they were doing location scouting for the film in the Omaha area. They needed a high school to film Election in, and one of the schools they visited was Chris Klein's, and Klein had one of those teachers who suggested he put himself forward. So this got some traction, and Klein eventually took a look at the script when Payne was very interested in him, and he was worried that his character was, again, let's do this delicately, let's just say his character was pleasured. And he noted to Payne that his grandma would be watching the film, and he's not particularly sure that he wanted to put that on screen. It was Payne in the end, who just assured the actor, well, let's kind of see where we go with this, but let's just have a bit of trust, which is ultimately how it worked out. The other roles soon came together. I mean, Jessica Campbell came in the role of Tammy Metzler, for instance, and it was all ready for shooting. That it got the green light off MTV, that somehow it had made it through the system. They were happy with the casting of Broderick in the end, and with a fairly light budget, really. I mean, the cost of Election is pegged somewhere around $10 million. They got to shooting in October of 1997. Now, this film needed a high school to shoot in, and Payne really envisaged that he wanted the high school to kind of look like a prison, to resemble that. And they were looking around Omaha, hoping that they could find somewhere that would just give them what they were after. But that hope didn't last an awful long time, because if you want to shoot in a school, inevitably at some point you've got to show the script to the people who run the school or to the local school board. And the script that Payne and Jim Taylor had written, well, it was fruity. It had words in it that perhaps aren't to the liking of some school boards, and basically the school board in Omaha took a look at the screenplay and all but ran a mile in the other direction. That it was conflicted. On the one hand, great, here comes a Hollywood movie shooting in this town, brilliant. On the flip side, oh my God, look what's in the Hollywood movie. And so what happened is they just had to move a little bit further afield. That they found a small town called Papillion, and they found a high school in there that was allowing them to shoot during the day. And so what Payne would also do was he hired local teachers and students just to take on small background and small roles in the film itself. And ahead of shooting, the high school that they were shooting in, well, had a new student for a few days, that Reese Witherspoon, then not a massive movie star, remember, although she'd had some screen presence and she'd had some notable roles. Well, she attended the high school undercover, pretending to be a transfer student for a few days, just so she could get a flavour of the place, and wasn't recognised. People just went about their business, and she was given the chance just to blend in for better or worse. Now, when it actually came to rehearsals and when it came to the filming itself, Witherspoon would admit that at first she was intimidated by the idea of working with Matthew Broderick. And understandable, really, when you consider what Matthew Broderick is to high school movies. And she said, we were a little adversarial in the movie, so it wasn't like we were suddenly chums. But she reflected to the Huffington Post, we had a good relationship, which is very funny, but it was always a little bit about keeping that tension for the sake of the movie. And so Matthew Broderick was in town, Reese Witherspoon was in town, but the conflict still came up. There was still pushback from local parents against the movie. I mean, there's talk of a porn film in the script. There's a lesbian relationship. This kind of thing wouldn't do in the 1990s. But as Brian Rafferty notes in his book as well, on the flip side, you've got Matthew Broderick on a bike riding around town, becoming part of the town. And so what really did they want? It was, let's just say there was conflict bubbling around the shooting of the film, offset by the celebrity and the profile that it brought with it. Now, Chris Klein was very, very raw. And he just didn't know his way around a movie set. He's fairly upfront about this as well. That he talked about, we get started for the very first time. I put two and two together and I said, they don't play the music during the shoot. All the scenes in movies have music. How come they don't play the music while we're shooting it? And it was stuff like that he just wasn't aware of. And he said, that means I'm actually going to have to manufacture real feelings without the aid of music. And he's just said that was a revelation for him. And he expressed a lot of thanks to Alexander Payne for really the patience that he showed him and the fact that he was explaining what was going on, and, quote, for launching me into the zany world of Hollywood. There were a couple of scenes that required a school assembly to be put together, and that needed an awful lot of people, and a call went out for people to turn up on a Saturday to fill out the school assembly so that they could shoot it, and bluntly, they did not get enough people to fill the hall, that they needed to put across the impression of around 1,000 people in this assembly. They didn't get it. And so what they did is they got everyone into the school gymnasium, put them all on one side of the gymnasium first of all, and then they decided to just shoot them all again on the other side of the gymnasium, but just messing up the order that everyone was sat in. And so if you look very carefully at the movie, you will see in the background, in the assembly, that the same people are sat in the assembly hall in two different places, if you particularly want to look at it that forensically. Now, shooting would wrap up on Election in December of 1997, and the edit, but Kevin Tent being the editor of the film, it did have problems because what they realised, Alexander Payne was conscious when they were shooting, he just didn't feel they had the ending as they were shooting the film. He didn't feel they'd nailed it. They hadn't completely got what he was after. And when they started cutting it together, what they'd ended up with was a finale to the film that was tonally an awful lot nicer than the hour and a bit that came before it. And to say that it stuck out and didn't fit was not an understatement at all. And so they didn't have anything else in their collection of footage that they could use. So they had to take this to the head of Paramount at the time, Sherry Lansing, a name that comes up on this podcast a lot. And they gathered in her office, and she saw the footage and she saw the problem as well. And usefully for Alexander Payne and the producers of the movie, she was a huge fan of what they were putting together. She really believed in the film, and she was engaged to the point where she actually had a suggestion as to how the film should end. And it was a suggestion that clicked with Payne and Jim Taylor, one that they could expand upon and write down. And so once they got that, Lansing agreed to release some extra funds just to shoot some extra material, just to give it the ending that the story deserved. It wasn't quite that simple though, because they needed Matthew Broderick for the ending, and the Matthew Broderick who didn't have work was now the Matthew Broderick who did have work. He was off in Washington, he was off in New York, he was making the film, get this, Inspector Gadget. Now, Inspector Gadget is not a great film, but it does have a terrific scene where they gather together lots of Bond villains. It's worth checking out just for that. But it was a big scale production, a big blockbuster, and here was Election, which was a smaller guerrilla film, gorilla with a U, and so they had to work around Broderick. They had to basically take the cameras to where he was to capture the final footage and the final scene that they needed in the film. Now, the final scene in the film is outstanding, but they had to wait nearly a year to get it. It was at the end of 1998, the final pickup shots of Election were in the can, and then they could put the film forward for test screenings. And just when you're thinking, oh, wonder if the film will catch a break, it did not catch a break at all. The test screenings for Election did not go well. Now, what I couldn't find out is just what kind of film was teased to the people who were coming to the test screening, but it was very clear that anyone who walked in expecting a traditional high school movie was not walking out thinking they got one. How about that? And so the easy thing here would have been for Paramount executives to do an about turn to soften the movie, but to be fair to the studio, it really held its nerve. And as Jim Taylor noted, it was a problematic film for Paramount and MTV Films to release because they thought if it was really a teen movie, they'd know how to market it. And Taylor would reflect, it kind of went out in a satisfactory way, but there was no big hoopla about it. And you had the problem of what looked on the surface as a teen high school movie, but also this R rating. And, the trailer that was put together was notably poor. Alexander Payne would describe it as the worst trailer in the world. And fielding some of the calls was producer David Gale, and he would talk to Brian Rafferty, and he just said, I had terrible calls with people at the studio. How could you do this to us? This is a bad movie, Paramount was saying to him. And then out came this trailer that presented Election, in his words, as the tale of a religious teen, one with an ego the size of the Grand Canyon, who teams up with her mum to run for class president. And as Gale reflected, it was like trying to sell Jaws as a fishing trip comedy, and no one really knew what to do with it. And this was reflected by the other producers. Ron Yerkser would also add, we would go into marketing meetings and it was like a dead pig on the table. It was a dispiriting time, and Paramount had no idea really how to package it, how to sell it, and how to put it out there. It got to the point where there was said to have been a discussion at one stage of Election just bypassing cinemas altogether, that Paramount would cut its losses and just put it straight out onto DVD, where it would get, it was a fairly cheap film, so it wouldn't be losing an awful lot. It might even make a profit. Straight to DVD movies were doing particularly well. But for some reason, someone out there decided, again, hold their nerve. And however poorly the film was being sold, and in hindsight, it's hard to disagree with that, it was released in April of 1999. And the critical response to it was, I mean, when you consider how much the film is lauded now, I don't think the critical response was absolutely ecstatic, but it was certainly very strong. Strong to very strong. A few people not quite so keen, but the people who really liked it really, really loved it. I mean, notably, Election was a film that went on to get an Oscar nomination for its screenplay. It didn't win, but nonetheless, it was ranked that level. But even the way people categorise it turns up on lists of the funniest movies and of the best high school movies and things like that. And it's kind of a combination of a lot of things that prove to be really hard to say. Is it a satire? Is it a dark comedy? Or what is it? I mean, Alexander Payne said he was told it was Barack Obama's favourite political film, but Barack Obama is one ticket sale, and there weren't that many more when it came out that weekend of April the 23rd, the 25th, because Paramount wasn't as strong at curating smaller films. You go to some people like Focus Features, you go to the old New Line Cinema, they would roll these films out slowly. Paramount tried that, put it out on 6 screens on its opening weekend, and the screen average was good, just shy of $20,000, an opening weekend of $119,000. But on 6 screens, that's decent money, and particularly hoping then that the word of mouth would build up. There were lots of big films around. This was not being quietly released in awards time, where you kind of expect films to get a bit more room and more legs to expand. This was in blockbuster season. The Matrix was top of the chart, and that was on its 4th week and taking lots of money. The Eddie Murphy, Martin Lawrence film Life, underrated movie, that was in 2nd place. Never Been Kissed, Pushing Tin, Analyze This, 10 Things I Hate About You, a great film that is, but a softer rating and probably more an easier film to sell. That was in the top 10, as was Go, as was The Out of Towners, as was Forces of Nature, the Ben Affleck, Sandra Bullock. Election would expand slowly over the next week or two, and gradually, the word of mouth was still strong, but the competition was tough as well. Sean Connery in Entrapment was opening the 2nd week opposite Catherine Zeta-Jones, and it was on its 3rd week that Election's screen count went up to a point where it could crash the top 10 at last. And on 827 screens in America, it got to 5th place with $3 million. The other film opening that weekend, that would be The Mummy, 43 million, absolutely trounced it. And Election was just kind of, as good as the word of mouth was, Election was struggling for footing, really, and it never really clicked. It didn't get the full run. By the time The Phantom Menace came out towards the end of May, Election had been in cinemas for 5 weeks and was starting to drop at speed. In the end, in the US, $14 million wasn't a bad return, really, for a film that was so economical to put together, particularly when you considered DVD was to come. The overall box office, 3 more million outside of the US. It wasn't a hit. It wasn't a flop, but it wasn't a hit. It hadn't really cut through. And for a while, interviews with Alexander Payne talk about it being almost like a lost film, that it was so missold, it completely lost its chance to make an impact. Although it didn't. In the end, it kind of found its way through and over time has endured. Payne would go straight on to do some screenplay work on films like Meet the Parents and Jurassic Park 3, but it was About Schmidt in 2002 and then particularly Sideways in 2004 that really launched him as a major filmmaking talent in the US. Election, I think, is the one that's absolutely at the core of that. But Election, the very fact we're talking about it, 24 years later, a fairly modest box office performer, but an absolutely scathing, brilliant film that does not hold its punches at all. There was talk, for a little while, about could they expand the story? Could they go back to the tale of Tracy Flick? They've very wisely decided not to do that. That leaves Election as something of a one-off, a brilliant one-off as well, standing quite differently from the many high school comedies of the time. In a double bill with American Pie, it might be a bit trickier there, but I just think in terms of late 1990s American, almost independent cinema, although not really, it's just a minor masterpiece, isn't it? Which brings me to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you for listening and thank you for your time. I'm just going to do some parish notices now, including the news that I can now talk about, that on Friday the 15th of December 2023, one of my favourite Christmas movies is getting a very, very rare big screen outing. That we have secured a print of Kenneth Branagh's 1995 festive comedy In the Bleak Midwinter, about a bunch of actors putting on a production of Hamlet on Christmas Eve. I love this film. I think this is a hilarious film, and since 2018 I've been writing to Kenneth Branagh's office to try and get a screening of it put on. I am delighted to say that in aid of the charity Centrepoint, which is where our profits from this will go, In the Bleak Midwinter will be playing at Picture House Central in London for a Film Stories special presentation on Friday the 15th of December, and I got Kenneth Branagh to come along as well and record a live podcast straight afterwards. You can buy tickets now. If you just search Picture House Central, you will find it on Friday the 15th of December. If you like this podcast and want to support it in any way, well, other than listening, and I love the fact that you've listened, that is the best way you can support it, and I thank you for that. If you want to put some money in the pot and help us grow, help us do other things, just help pay the bills really, if you go to patreon.com/SimonBrew, you'd have found the Kenneth Branagh news out early for one. You get the podcast ad free. You also get it early most weeks as well. Find out other gossip of what I'm up to. That's patreon.com/SimonBrew. Meanwhile, costing you absolutely nothing is, I mean, if you're subscribing to the podcast, your podcast home of choice, that helps enormously too. Likewise, leaving ideally a hugely positive review. Also, we have print magazines. If you go to store.filmstories.co.uk, that's where you can find Film Stories magazine. I'm just putting the finishing touches to the latest issue of that. It's going to be another 168-page bumper issue. It's nearly killing me. And Film Junior magazine as well. I mean, perfect Christmas gift for a young film fan. Imagine that, print film magazines just for youngsters. It's the magazine I wish had existed growing up. It does exist now, but it does need support to keep going. You can find those at store.filmstories.co.uk. But now I'm going to move on to the other film I'm talking about in this episode of Film Stories. I'm staying in the 1990s, and a film really that in its own way has become something of a cultural phenomenon. Let me play you a clip from the trailer. I'll come to the story the other side of this.
Have you ever wondered what might have been? Would things be different if you caught the train instead of missing it? How much would your life change if you were 10 minutes early?
Hello?
Instead of 10 minutes late?
Helen? If I had just caught that train, I'd have been home ages ago.
You don't want to go wondering about things like that.
Now, Helen's life is about to go down two different tracks. Gwyneth Paltrow and Gwyneth Paltrow in the story of a woman about to choose between a life with a man she's always loved.
Terry, I asked a simple question. I mean, there's no need to become Woody Allen.
And a life with a man she's just met.
I kissed you.
Yeah, I spotted that.
So that's a clip from 1998's Sliding Doors, written and directed by Peter Howitt and starring Gwyneth Paltrow, John Hannah, John Lynch and Jeannie Tripplehorn. So the story of Sliding Doors goes back to Peter Howitt, an actor by trade, known for many in the UK of a certain generation as one of the key parts of the ensemble of the BBC's hit sitcom Bread, written by Carla Lane, where he played the lead, one of the lead roles, Joey Boswell, in that. And at the height of the show's fame, he walked away from that role. It was a real surprise at the time. The show decided to recast it, but it never really quite gelled in the same way once one or two of the actors had walked away. But the thing was, Howitt had other plans. He was moving towards other work. So he took on a mix of acting roles across film and television. And as he told the Los Angeles magazine in May of 1998, he was walking on London's Charing Cross Road and a car nearly hit him. And it just set him thinking, what would happen if the car had hit? That was the spark. It gradually evolved into a story, and he sat down and started writing it. Small problem, he'd never sat down and tried to write anything quite like this before, and heck, was this going to be a struggle. It would be fair to say that the screenplay to Sliding Doors did not come easily at all. In fact, around the time of the film's release, he would tell the Evening Standard in London that it took 7 years to just nail the script. It took 20 rewrites. And in the midst of it all, he suffered a nervous breakdown as well. He said, all I could do was stay in my flat in Fulham and cry and write the script for Sliding Doors. And he described this process. He just said the worst lasted about 3 months. Then I slowly began to get better. Now I'm really glad it happened. In particular, one of the challenges that Howitt was finding was nailing the ending, because he told The Ringer, looking back at the film, he said, I remember having dinner one night when I was about 80 pages into the script. So that's that, an hour 20 by standard screenplay. 1 page of screenplay equals 1 minute of screen time. And he said to my girlfriend at the time, I don't know how I'm going to end this. And she said sort of flippantly, spoiler time, well, you're going to have to kill one of them. And I knew that was exactly right. But even then, he still had to make it all work. And he got to a point where he just wasn't cutting his hair until he had the thing written. And when he did finally get to the screenplay to what he considered a finished point, well, he showed it to a mate of his. And that mate happened to be an actor by the name of John Hannah. Now, the pair of them had been friends, and Hannah would quickly sign up. In fact, at one point, he just said, I'll work on this for free. I'll just do this. I just really want to do it. And not long behind John Hannah was Minnie Driver, who was in line to take the lead role, the dual lead role, as it happens in the film. And so for a little while, it looked like the film was just pressing ahead towards the mid to back end of the 1980s. Howitt was going to be making his directorial debut as well. I mean, he'd been on lots of sets, so he knew his way around them, but this was a first-time writer, a first-time director. He'd acted in a couple of films. He'd taken on, for instance, the role of remand prison officer in The Name of the Father, and just roles really of that size. But just as it looked like things were going to move forward, the financing fell through. This happened a lot with British independent films in the 1990s, and it needed a real stroke of luck, as was helpful for the selling of the movie, its own Sliding Doors moment, for the film to come together. Because this came down to John Hannah, and it was talked about in Helen de Winter's book, What I Really Want to Do Is Produce, that John Hannah was due to have a meeting with someone who would turn the fortunes of the film around. That someone would be a producer, director, actor as well, the legendary and much missed Sidney Pollack. Now, Pollack had just set up a producing deal with a company called Intermedia, and he was on the lookout for projects. Intermedia were expecting Pollack to produce films. He needed films to produce, so he was keenly looking for scripts and something that he could make. And then he happened to be meeting John Hannah just as Sliding Doors tumbled, and the pair got talking. That Hannah was said to not be in the happiest of places, and he relayed to Pollack how this film was due to go. Now it wasn't due to go, that things had fallen apart relatively late in the day. And so Pollack asked to take a look at the script, and he duly did so and liked it. In fact, he really liked it, and so much so that he gave a man called Guy East at the company Intermedia a phone call, and he just said that there is this film and I think we should do it. The proposed budget at the time was around $3 million to make. And that's really shoestring for what they were looking to do, particularly because this was going to involve a lot of location filming as well. And Guy East quizzed Pollack. Pollack had the conversation with him. And, I mean, there were inevitably questions about the inexperience of the director. I mean, Howitt had done a short that he'd done at film school. He showed that to Sidney Pollack. But Pollack really believed in the script. That was the crucial thing here. That was the key ingredient, that the screenplay really clicked with him, and he built up a trust over meetings with Peter Howitt, and just thought, this guy could probably do it. And so the money was secured. In fact, the budget would go up slightly off the back of the funding that Pollack was able to bring in. But as we're about to discover, Sidney Pollack brought a lot more than just the catalyst for the money to the production. So John Hannah was definitely in. I mean, he was core. He was first through the door. But who else? Well, Minnie Driver was no longer involved. And while the casting was going on, the script also, a bit more work was needed to be done, because what Pollack did was then he sat down with Peter Howitt and he worked with him, and the pair of them shaped the script. And it was a complex one as well. If you're unfamiliar with the way Sliding Doors is set up, and I can't imagine you are, whether you've seen the film or not, but just briefly, it's a moment of what if you didn't. It ultimately boils down to, what if you didn't get the train? What would happen to your life if you got that train, if you didn't get that train? And as a result, the script has dual timelines, dual narratives really to it, with the same bunch of characters who have to still be the same characters, but just going through different things, and it has to be clear to the audience what's going on. All challenges that needed to be negotiated primarily at script stage. That finished script, though, was what ultimately lured Gwyneth Paltrow to the lead role. And this was quite a coup as well for a British independent film. At this stage in her career, her star was very much on the up. In 1995, she'd appeared in the film Seven, for instance. That was her first really high-profile role. In 1996, she got a lot of acclaim for taking the title role in an adaptation of Emma. And in fact, it would turn out that 1998 was her year, that Sliding Doors would be one of four or five films she took on that year, all of which got a great deal of profile. But Sliding Doors was a film she took even as she was turning down Titanic and a lot of other major studio, very expensive films for which she was which she was attracting offers for. But she really liked Howitt's script, really went for it. She said, I was so overwhelmed by how good the writing was and the concept, I couldn't find anything to compare it to. I just thought it was so unique. So Hannah, Gwyneth Paltrow, the rest of the cast coming together, Sliding Doors was finally pressing forward. Filming would begin on April the 1st, 1997, and this film shot in London. I mean, it used tube stations very much at the heart of the narrative switch in the film, and it used actual active tube stations. It went to Fulham Broadway Underground Station, Embankment Underground Station. It was, it was around, I think it was at Waterloo at one point as well. And it was having really to make that shoot work while lots of people were around. That Gwyneth Paltrow wasn't a major movie star at this point, but she was still recognisable. And also, there weren't that many films shooting in and around the streets of London, so it was notable when one turned up. Now, Pollack would admit that at first Peter Howitt struggled a bit with the film because it was his first. Why wouldn't you? It's his directorial debut. And also Pollack said it's a tough film to organise because it's telling two stories with the same person. However, most of his time on the production would be spent before and after shooting, that he would come on set for a small part of it, but what he actively didn't want to do was go up to a director in the middle of directing a film and ask that director questions, leave them to do the job. And so what he would do was, while Howitt was shooting the movie, he would retreat and just look at the monitor and just be a little bit away from where the main action was. If Paltrow was expecting a massive Hollywood production with huge trailers, she absolutely didn't get it. This was a lot more everybody in it together kind of film. And it was a film that, I mean, most people really just talk about. It was such a joy to make. I mean, it's telling actually that I think it was Gillian Anderson said that this was one of the roles she regretted not getting, that she'd seen the script and really wanted that lead role of Helen. Well, Gwyneth Paltrow seemingly had a terrific time making the movie and was very present. You know, it wasn't a case of when your scenes aren't being shot, you completely disappear. John Hannah would admit actually in an interview with Teletext. Do you remember Teletext? Crikey. He would admit in an interview with Teletext that he had a tougher time with this because, I mean, his character was just, he said, I had quite a difficult time. I couldn't work out why I was so unhappy. I was getting loads of work. I just got married. I went to a therapist for a bit, he said. Then I realised I needed to grow up and accept my change of status. You have to learn to relish your happiness. This was not the kind of character he'd played before. And a romantic lead, really, in a romantic comedy, and one with quite a demeanour to him. They were also having to shoot this relatively quickly. I mean, the filming wrapped up at the end of May 1997. So it was, 6-7 weeks was all they had. And most of it was out and about on their travels. So they had to move quickly to get their shots. Then there was the challenge and a half, because if putting the script to Sliding Doors together had been a monumental task for Peter Howitt, well, editing it all into something that made sense at a manageable length, that was a whole new ball game altogether for him. And it was one that inevitably proved tough. Sidney Pollack would admit, that when it came to the edit, that's where he got heavily involved. I mean, they got the cut down to 99 minutes in the end, but it took a lot of work to do so. And as Pollack would say, it was marrying up these stories that was the enormous challenge. And so he was in the edit with Howard as they gradually mashed it together. And as Peter Howitt would ultimately reflect, Sidney Pollack taught me more about editing and character than anyone or anything else. He said, I couldn't even begin to tell you what I learned from Sidney. He was really, really lovely. That was the grand Sliding Doors moment for me, which just happened to be a Sliding Doors moment that brought about the making of the film Sliding Doors. This whole thing of getting Sidney Pollack involved to teach a new director effectively how to direct while still giving Howitt the space to tell the story that he wanted to tell. Meanwhile, the film was finding overseas distributors. That it was picked up by Paramount. It was picked up by Paramount, distributed it in America and the UK in the end. Miramax had put some money into it. Mirage Enterprises had put some money into it as well. And the idea was take the first cut of it, take the premiere of the film to the Sundance Film Festival at the start of 1998, give it a launch there and just see if you can kind of build something, as many films have managed to build up from Sundance over the years and continue to do so. I mean, look at the Best Picture winner Coda, for instance, just a couple of years ago. Now, one thing that happened in post-production was that Peter Howitt called on one of his friends for a bit of help. That friend would be Brian May of the band Queen, and he asked him for a song for the film. And so May would duly turn this song around in under 24 hours, apparently. It was called Another World. But in the end, the song had to be dropped from the movie. And the reason being, one of the investors in the film was a record company that, let's just say, was not Brian May's record company. And so the streams were just not allowed to cross at this point. And that Brian May would instead use Another World on his next solo album. There was one song that did make it onto the soundtrack, a song called Thank You by Dido, which was on the soundtrack CD a couple of years before it went on to be a massive hit. It could be heard in Sliding Doors earlier than that, if you're 2 years ahead of yourself, if you wanted to catch it at that point. And then it was a case of seeing what people made of the film. And the initial reception at the Sundance Film Festival was pretty good. That there was a feeling that at heart there was a gimmick to it, but they'd managed to make the gimmick work, and it was likeable. The central romance was likeable. It was funny. It was, but it wasn't. You didn't get a sense that it would become quite the cultural thing at that stage that it's gone on to become. But there was still confidence that with the personnel involved that they could make a return on this. It had gone on to cost about $6 million in the end. So really quite cheap for a romantic comedy with a recognisable name at the heart of it. And so it was scheduled by Paramount for April, the end of April in 1998, and the start of May in the UK in 1998. It's coming out in the States first. And in the States, did all right, really. It didn't go absolutely mad, but it opened on 117 screens on the weekend of the 24th to the 26th of April. You have to go down the chart a little bit. You find it in 17th place, screen average of $7,000, but a fairly tidy $834,000 to open up with. The top film that weekend, the big new release, was The Big Hit, which opened with $10 million. It's fair to say that's quite a different movie. The other films around, there wasn't a lot of competition. City of Angels, The Object of My Affection. Titanic had been around for 19 weeks at that point. Lost in Space movie was about. The most successful big opener outside of The Big Hit was Tarzan and the Lost City, which didn't even crack the top 10. Really, that had Casper Van Dien. It was his first big post Starship Troopers role, if memory serves. But Sliding Doors had done enough to give confidence, to just kind of expand the release a little bit. Screen count went up the second week, and it broke into the top 10. 1.6 million its second weekend on release in the US, as Spike Lee's terrific He Got Game opened in top spot with 7 $7 million. And it just hung around a little bit, really. It wasn't ever really threatening the top half of the chart, but the summer blockbusters were coming as well. Deep Impact followed the week after, as Sliding Doors slipped out of the top 10. And then it was The Horse Whisperer the week after that, Quest for Camelot the week after that, Godzilla the week after that. And so it was a bit of a stampede of films, really, that didn't give Sliding Doors an enormous amount of space to get its oxygen at the box office. Still, in the US, it did ish, but in the UK, it had a terrific response. £12 million it took in the UK, and one of the biggest hits, certainly one of the biggest UK hits of the year. And the overall box office in the end, $67 million, which for a very modestly costed film, well, it was one hell of a result, really. But then the people involved with it were just happy with it. I mean, you go to the charity premiere, well, I don't, and Gwyneth Paltrow told Empire about how I've always hated my films, but I'm really proud of this one. Peter Howitt knew what he had as well, and he told The Standard that immediately as it started to get success, the offers were coming in. He said, I've been offered $1 million to direct in America, which is very exciting. But he did say it's a very similar story to this one, and it's a good time for us here, and I want to support the UK industry. That notwithstanding, he went on straight away to direct in America. He directed the film Antitrust, quite the Microsoft story, really, although just in case there are lawyers listening, I am not accusing Microsoft of antitrust, not just because I can't afford to do so, obviously. Gwyneth Paltrow, actually, straight after completing work on Sliding Doors, went on to make a film. She was straight onto the set of a film called what? Shakespeare in Love. Wonder how that would turn out. But how it would reflect to the Ringer many years later, he just says that Sliding Doors is the film that he's most proud of. And he says he notices every reference or allusion when they occur, which happen frequently, but still feel like an unexpected and welcome surprise. But as he went on to direct films like the first Johnny English movie, the rom-com Laws of Attraction, starring Julianne Moore and Pierce Brosnan, and I think Dangerous Parking was one of his as well. He knew, and he's seen, as the rest of them have done, just what Sliding Doors has done as a kind of cultural thing. That the number of times a Sliding Doors moment tends to come up in conversation, and it does sort of go back to this film that someone just sat for years and years and years to try and pull together, even against mental health problems, against struggles, against haircut problems, and managed to get the script completed. It's whether you like the film or not. I know some people, if you go on Richard Herring's podcast, he is not a fan of Sliding Doors and has had a lot to say about it. Conversely, I know many people who remain completely charmed by it. It was a real standout success story at a point in the UK where, outside of Hugh Grant and working title movies, they were not in abundance. Again, just as with Election, we're talking about it decades later for slightly different reasons. I think it's had a cultural impact for a different reason, but still, here we are, decades later, talking about the making of a film that, had it come around today, might just have ended up on a streaming service to be forgotten for all time. How would that have been for a Sliding Doors moment? Which brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you so much for listening, and thank you for your time. If I've not bored you completely, you can find more from me on Twitter, whatever it's called, at Simon Brew. I'm on Blue Sky as well, for those who are on there. That's also at Simon Brew. Film Stories is at Film Stories. You can find us on YouTube, youtube.com/Film Stories, facebook.com/Film Stories online. We're at store.filmstories.co.uk. That's where you'll find all of our print magazines and Blu-rays for sale. We're now shipping Blu-rays in the UK. The first UK Blu-ray releases of the 80s films, Bull Durham and No Way Out. Terrific pair of movies that. We're at did I say YouTube? youtube.com/Film Stories. And if you go to filmstories.co.uk, that is updated every weekday with movie news, reviews, mayhem. We're doing bits of TV and gaming on there as well. We've seen traffic go up, and it's hugely appreciated. Thank you to everyone who supports the Film Stories project, this mad independent film and TV and game appreciation project, really, that over 5 years on still seems to be going. I'm going to leave you in peace for now, though. I've got more films to watch. I've got more podcasts to prepare for. The most important thing, as always, is you all take care. You all look after yourselves. I will be back soon with another bunch of film stories. Until then, stay safe. Take care. Bye-bye.